Good afternoon, Guyana, and welcome to another episode of Guyana's Oil and You. I am your hostess, senior journalist of Kaieteur News, Kiana Wilburg, and today we will be discussing two exciting topics and discussing the nexus between those two: climate change and using a portion of our oil money to build sustainable industries. Helping us to continue this discussion today will be Professor Narayan, Suresh Narayan. He is the director of the Institute of Applied Science and Technology, and he's also the head of CGX. Professor Narayan, welcome to our program, and thank you for being part of today's discussion.
Thank you, Kiana. Thanks for inviting me.
Great. So we're going to jump right into today's conversation, and I'd like to start with the fact that climate change has taken on a new sense of urgency, especially at a time when Guyana has now started its journey as a new oil producer. With that in mind, how do you believe oil companies can play a role in the decarbonization movement while still ensuring return for their investors?
So you're starting off with the large punches, huh, Kiana? So good afternoon to your listeners. It is indeed a very important subject. And before I begin to answer directly your question, let us not forget that climate change in our region, across the world, of course, but in our region, is a particularly threatening phenomena. Several of our Caribbean nations are already seeing increased salinity due to rising um, sea levels. And of course, we have seen an almost monotonic rise in the number of serious storms within the past 10 years. Our region is also a region with very fragile ecosystems, very fragile infrastructure. And so we are particularly at risk with climate change. It's not a phenomena, despite what some large news networks may wish to say, that is a fallacy. It is very real, and I've spent a lot of my time professionally explaining quite simply why it is real. Now, we are still in a very much fossilized economy. The demand for fossil energy has not abated, and mainly because renewables have simply not increased in scale in order to offer serious challenges to the fossilized economy at this point. And perhaps later in the show, we can talk about how things like population increases. We can talk about how large economies like China and India, as they become more affluent and they move into the middle class, how their consumption of energy also increases, and what the projections are for the fossil economy. So oil and gas companies, at their very core, to address your question after that preamble, at their very core, oil and gas companies are companies. Companies are predicated on returns on investment to their shareholders. And insofar as fossil energy continue to offer a return on investment, people will continue to invest in it. But at their core, I think all oil and gas companies understand that if they don't look forward to what the forecasts in the future may bring, that the act of doing business only focused on your core business may preclude doing business in the future. And so we have seen many of the majors, for example, underscoring that they are energy companies first and foremost, as opposed to just fossil fuel energy companies. And we've seen a move by many of the world's majors and super majors to have a portion of their investment portfolio in renewables. But I know that your question is particularly directed at Guyana and not necessarily just the world. And yes, we are embarking on a brand new fossil economy. And your question is quite appropriate. How it is that those companies that are investing here can play a role in the decarbonizing of our economy. Well, I want to say that if Guyanese continue to sit back and expect companies who are predicated on bottom line, as they must be, there is nothing philosophically or morally repugnant about companies whose raison d'etre is to address their bottom lines. There's nothing repugnant about them doing just so. However, Guyanese must relinquish the notion that the direction of our economy, whether it's a carbon economy or a decarbonized economy or it's sustainable, that we must not relinquish the driver's seat of where we go to companies. It is very important that as Guyanese, we understand very clearly, with absolute crystal clarity, that this is our country, all of us, every single person here, at all economic stratas, all ethnicities. This is our country and we need to drive. Now, if we leave a vacuum for companies to drive, understanding that companies are constituted with only one goal in mind, it is impossible for those companies to lead us into sustainability. So if we take that and we understand the gravitas of that statement to our population, then we can begin a conversation on how those companies can help us decarbonize. One, as I've said before, they are fundamentally companies that don't want to watch their core resource dwindle or the demand for it drop off. Then they will not be able to be in business. So we need to articulate absorptive solutions to those companies. How, as a nation, are we going to put opportunities in front of oil and gas companies that are lucrative alternatives to fossil fuels? And that asks a policy question, it asks a question of taxation, it asks a question of skilled labor, it asks a question of national will. And if we do so, I think that we would be able to present an economic incentive for energy companies to also invest in the decarbonized economy. Of course, corporate social responsibility does play a role. And so at the fledgling state, particularly as we look towards unifying, focusing, and organizing how the energy sector responds to their corporate social footprint, we need to lead them so that these companies are not fragmented, that their efforts can be put into policy-driven imperatives that we as Guyanese underscore is necessary. Because that will remove the doubt, it will allow critical mass. So if you have 10 companies, if each of them are contributing to projects in communities that relate to decarbonization, then that creates, but we have to lead that process. Every single oil and gas company in this country has a CSR budget. We should be saying to them in a clarion call, this is the percentage of your CSR that we would like to see in the decarbonized economy. Because philosophically, there is no barrier, there is no mental, business, commercial investment barrier between a company investing in fossilized energy and a company investing in renewable energy. Not all renewable energy, of course, is decarbonized, but in renewable energy, as long as the returns on investment can be managed, as long as there's absorptive capacity in the society, and as long as it's led by growth strategies. So I really want to say the future is quite bright. It is a bright, shining future, but we need to seize it and stop gazing at our midsections, take our heads out of the sand, and understand that this patrimony we have been given through the discovery of carbon fossil fuels on our shores, that opportunity brings with it a great responsibilities to posterity. And we need to seize it. We must not look for leadership outside of these shores.
Thank you very much, Professor Narayan. I really take that point that even as we expect to have the oil companies play a role in the decarbonization movement of Guyana, at the end of the day, we need to be able to lead that process and say, well, this is what we expect at the end of the day. So thank you for that point. And as we mentioned a bit there about renewables, I'd like to turn to my next question, which is the talk of transitioning to renewables. Now, Guyana has made it clear that it intends to move in this direction, but we also have the interest there on the part of the government to develop our oil and gas resources offshore Guyana. With those two in mind, the transition to renewables as well as the interest to develop the oil assets, do you believe we have a limited window or time frame within which to develop those assets even as we move to renewables?
It's a multifaceted question, Kiana, and perhaps permit me to go a little bit slowly on answering it. Um, the world's gluttony, and I use that word in a considered way, the word's gluttony for the consumption of energy hasn't abated. In fact, we're supposed to see a 20% increase in population growth by 2040. We're going to see, even the fact that the world's economies have slowed down, we're likely to see between a 2.7 to a 3.4% growth in GDP across the world average per annum. We are likely to see a continuing increase in the number of people eating meat in the world. And that has a large impact on fossil fuels demands because still 70 to 85% of our fertilizers in the world comes from fossil fuels. So we live in a very interconnected world of demand between fossil fuels. A little known fact is up to 16% of all of the petroleum we take out of the ground actually goes into making materials. And if you look around your studio, plastics, for example, are ubiquitous in our environment. Where do plastics come from? 99.5% comes from fossil fuels. Your car, a 1963 Harley Davidson used to have about 95% steel. It now has 60% plastic. Where does that plastic come from? Fossil fuels. So it is a very, very interconnected world in terms of demand. But yes, renewables are taking and should continue to take increasing market share. What has this been driven by? Clearly, it's also been increasingly driven by policies. California, for example, fifth largest economy in the world, although it's just a state, has up to 1/3 of its current electricity being generated by by renewables, and is still one of the world's largest fossil fuel economies. Germany, the UK. So there are ways of balancing these two initiatives without getting into conflict. The other imperative that's driving renewables, of course, is technology. So if we look at, for example, the price, well, let's look at electric car demands, for example. It's gone up 500% in the past 2 years, the projection for demand for electric cars. The price for lithium-ion batteries, which is essential to using solar renewable energy, has gone down from about $300 per kilowatt hour in 2016 to less than $200 per kilowatt hour in 2020, and it's an exponential decrease in prices. So technology is also driving this movement. So yes, the world's demand for fossil fuels will eventually go down as renewables come up to scale. What is important to understand and predict, and I would submit that very few of us have the ability to do so, certainly not I, is that the rate of population increase, the rate of the increase in demand for energy as more people in the world move it into the so-called middle class. They begin to eat meat, they begin to want air conditioning, they want to drive. The energy demand goes up due to population growth and due to changing lifestyles. What one needs to look at is when the two growth curves will cross. When will the increase in renewable capacity, when that curve crosses the curve related to population increase and growth, that is when we'll reach a turning point. But until then, energy from fossil fuels will continue to play a role. Not only that, there's a concept called the total energy demand to create energy. So when we use fossil fuels, of course, we don't just take it out of the ground and use it. There's a requirement to make it refined. And Guyana is in a particularly favorable state compared to, for example, the oil sands in Alberta or heavy onshore oil in Suriname. Guyana's oil is light sweet crude. At least that has been that which has been commercialized to date. This means it places the net amount of energy it takes to convert our fuel into our oil into fuel, into consumer ready fuels is less, which means that the margins related are also less. And so you have an economic imperative, but also, very importantly, an energy imperative, because the creation of energy costs energy. Additionally, geographically, Guyana is situated in a region which is a net importer of fuel. The Caribbean region provides a great demand for us. So the amount of distance you have to send energy also has an impact on the carbon footprint of that energy. So I don't think that we're about to see that our fossil fuel resources will become a stranded asset. I think that demand will continue, but like every commodity, we will have to keep our eyes on the future. I don't believe that we should rush to pump oil simply because we think the demand for oil should disappear. The rate at which we produce oil should be a function of the country's need, the country's desire to grow, and the country's absorptive capacity to absorb that growth. Because simply pumping as much as we can without a regard for what we need or what we can absorb will lead us into a pathway of economic overheating. It will lead us into an economy which we can't absorb, and eventually it will lead to the resource being squandered in terms of Guyana's future. So again, this comes back to this central theme. We as Guyanese need to understand where we want to go, and we need to use the resource in such a way as to get us there. That, of course, must also consider that we invite investors to engage in a highly risky business. And nobody will invest in that business unless, of course, you give them the opportunity to make enough return on investment. But it's not a complicated dance, you know. We have something they want. They will take risk. We need to ensure that that risk is incentivized. But we are not going to, or we should not, be developing our resource simply because we want foreign direct investment. In fact, it should be entirely the other way around. Let us articulate where we want to go. Let us then articulate a roadmap to get there. And let us realize that, yes, it will be a shifting goalpost. It shall be a shifting goalpost. But if we enable a conversation of clarity, a conversation where Guyanese are engaged across the spectrum, and if we do so respectfully, for 750,000 souls in this beautiful land, I can't imagine why we cannot manage it.
Thank you very much for that explanation there, Professor Narayan. We'll take a quick commercial break, and then we'll return to the other aspect of our discussion today, where we are hopeful of using part of our oil resource, our oil revenue, to build sustainable industries.
Taste that pure delight.
COVID-19 tips sponsored by Dex Soap. 1. Practice social distancing. 2. Wear your mask when leaving the house. 3. Wash your hands regularly for 20 seconds using our Dex Soap. 4. Cover your nose and mouth with a disposable tissue or flex elbow when you cough or sneeze. Choose Dex Soap for that extra cleanliness. Dex Soap is affordable and available nationwide. Win $100,000 monthly with Sleepy Sanitary Pads. Sleepy Sanitary Pads are all natural and are made with cotton and bamboo fibers. It is dye and lotion free, hence no irritations or rashes. Sleepy Sanitary Pads are available in 2 sizes, ultra thin and thick. It is affordable and available nationwide. See press for details. Visit our Sleepy South America Facebook page or call us on 233-2473.
Good afternoon once again, Guyana, and welcome to another edition of Guyana's Oil and You. Today we are discussing climate change and using a portion of our oil revenue to build sustainable industries. And to have this discussion with us today, we've invited Professor Suresh Narayan, who is the head of the Institute of Applied Science and Technology and the head of CGX. For those who are now joining us, we would have discussed some really important topics, one related to the role oil companies can play in the decarbonization movement. And we just concluded a discussion, or we were on the verge of concluding just a few points on the transition to renewables as that takes shape. If Guyana has a limited window or time frame to develop our assets. Professor Narayan, before we move to our next question, any concluding thoughts on that matter?
On that second question, Kiana, just to show you, to illustrate to your listeners how transformative innovation can be. Guyana has some of the world's most pristine deposits of silica sand. Now, one of the most important ingredients for solar panels is silica. Guyana silica, and this wasn't articulated now by me, Dr. Neville Trotz, who was the first director of the Institute of Applied Science and Technology and one of my mentors, has for decades been talking about the latent resource that our silica sand presents. Now, here's something that people don't know. The reason why solar panels are expensive is converting silica sand into solar panels takes a tremendous amount of energy. But this is one way where the energy intensity and density of fossil fuels can be used, if we drive it by policy, to convert our silica sand into leading the next wave of low-cost photovoltaics. And those are the kinds of very integrated solutions that the transitioning of a fossil economy into a renewable energy economy, those are the kinds of very important relationships that transition establishes. And of course, underscores a tremendous opportunity for this country to be truly a model on how we do that.
Thank you very much for that important point, actually, Professor Narayan. And I'd like to move to one of these sustainable industries, agriculture. And I know that for some time you would have said that CARICOM's food security is at a crisis level. With that in mind, how do you believe the oil money to come to Guyana can be used to help us change this narrative or discourse? And where do we actually start?
I think the single largest disaster, Kiana, that this country could engineer for itself is to ignore the immense promise that our agricultural potential provides us for sustainable growth. Now, not just I, but many leaders of Guyana. In fact, at one time, CARICOM, when it was led by Guyana led a discussion of how Guyana could underscore CARICOM's really huge problem with food. If the revenues from oil and gas is not as a matter of incontrovertible policy, regardless of political changes, that underscores a direct line investment in our agriculture, we would have missed the chance to truly make this country sustainable for all generations. I firmly believe that the most important resources of our future as a world are not fossil fuels, they're not steel, and they're not platinum, but they're arable land, fresh water, and the ability to grow food. Now, CARICOM, if you look at only the English-speaking CARICOM, is 16.5 million souls. That 16.5 million souls import about $5 billion annually for food. We're in COVID. The tourist contribution to the gross domestic product of many of our small islands are over 50 and 60%. As COVID expresses itself, the middle class type of tourist that goes to the high density resorts has dropped completely off, and we don't know when it shall rebound. That will be a tremendous impact on our neighbors' ability to generate income. Inevitably and inexorably, we are going to see a drop in the values of their currencies. So that $5 billion is going to buy so much less food because their currencies are going to drop. How does the Caribbean wean itself off this dependence? It has Guyana, it has Belize, it has Suriname. And until we begin, I know we're not talking about this, but until we begin to realize that this Caribbean archipelago is a tiny place and that agriculture and food security is our largest threat, we are not going to be able to surmount this problem. We will continue to be a region that is mendicant. I firmly believe that because Guyana can access the capital that comes from oil and gas in order to generate the investments in agriculture and food processing and food security that our region needs, that Guyana has suddenly become the epicenter of growth, but more importantly, of hope for our region. And we as Guyanese need to also understand that that is not only a source of national pride, it's also a source of a central responsibility that we have to not squander the future that we have in this country, not only for security for ourselves, but for our Caribbean region. And so I can't underscore enough that if there's a single investment sector that as a matter of policy that we focus oil and gas revenues on, if it's not agriculture, we would have missed the boat entirely.
Wow, that's a very strong point to end on, and I'd like to take you to the local industry, local products, which I know you're a very fierce and a passionate advocate for, in leading in particular indigenous and hinterland-based development. And on that note, I'd like to ask you, Professor Narayan, what structural and policy changes do you believe we need to focus on in order to further that kind of movement?
Kiana, you're way too young, and your producer here is also way too young to remember what happened after the Second World War. But the world's economies of North America and Europe was in the doldrums. In order to start to be competitive again, in order to drive economic growth and prosperity, I was about to say prospectivity. That word is never far from the mind of someone who prospects for a living, as I do, in oil and gas. But to drive growth and prosperity, there was a plan together called the Marshall Plan. I'd like to refer many of your listeners to the ability to Google at your fingertips. Google the Marshall Plan. And it was a plan that focused on massive investments in local productivity but massive investments in policy that drove local consumption. Now look at where we are today. COVID has all but shut off supply lines. Production has decreased across the world as factories have shut down. Food systems are under threat. And here in Guyana, we continue to be foreign-minded. We continue to think that anything that comes in a piece of plastic with beautiful colors on it is good for us. But the industries, let us take the cornflakes industry, for example, in the Midwest, which, by the way, the cornflakes industry was developed as a food that they fed to people with too much libido. It was a way to, people went to sanatoriums. Promiscuous people were put in sanatoriums to eat cornflakes because it felt it would decrease their sexual drive. This is, I mean, Google it, it's very true. And we will gladly lap this stuff up in Guyana simply because we've been so conditioned to believe that everything that comes from overseas is good. In fact, the fact that we were conditioned is something that should be reprehensible to us. Walter Rodney wrote this beautiful book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Very appropriate book. If you look at any contemporary book on neoliberalism, you begin to understand that the colonial imperial mentality still pervades our consumptive patterns. So yes, I'm absolutely in favor of local products. I believe that our own food security, if global food supplies are affected, the only way we are going to ensure our nation is fed is by encouraging our farmers to continue to produce and by voting with our feet. Now, of course, this does not alleviate our local food producers from offering food at competitive prices and very importantly, quality and nutrition. But unless our consumers wake up and understand that a dollar put into the local economy goes into increasing their own lot versus a dollar put into the Midwest of the United States of America, a dollar put into my adopted country, Canada, a dollar put into the economy of Japan, which does not come back here. We must, as a consumptive base of people, understand that local can be as good and much better than what is imported, but as a matter of policy. I think I heard, I saw in the newspapers a call by a Mr. Holder who was involved in the production of coffee. I don't know the gentleman, but there was a clarion call in the newspapers that I read that we need policy at this time to drive the resiliency of our local food products. I fully endorse that call because who will employ our people? Not the American Midwest.
On that note, Professor Narayan, should we use a portion of the oil money to sort of invest in incentives for local manufacturers, those in the agro-processing industry?
Absolutely. We have already, I believe, a regime where if you invest in agro-processing, it's tax-free for the capital equipment. But in order to incentivize a new generation of farmers and food processors, we should go further. If you work in the industry, we should use the capital from the oil industry to incentivize income taxes. We should use it to incentivize VAT-free for locally produced products and make it unambiguous. Remove the opaque bureaucracies that we see when we line up for even current products that are delisted for VAT. Ensure that we instill policies that we are going to retain what I firmly believe is our central value proposition in the country, our ability to grow wholesome food, to grow safe food, and to ensure food continuity. And yes, absolutely, we should be using those revenues to focus on those kinds of incentives. But we should go further. Every single national institution in this country where the taxpayers is hosting the bill for the public hospitals, for the police force, for the army, for our new opportunity corps, for any sort of government, taxpayer-funded initiative, those institutions should be required to justify why, if a product which meets nutritive and quality standards and at a competitive price that's produced here is being supplanted by a foreign import. We can start right there. It's a low-hanging fruit. The prisons, if we are going to feed a prison population, and we should not feed them substandard things. We should not feed our policemen substandard food. But as long as a local product can meet nutritive standards and quality standards and can be price competitive, as a nation, we should tomorrow be willing to make that. And if we can't do that, as a nation, we are being extremely myopic to our detriment. I really firmly, vehemently believe this. I've been up to yesterday, I was having this conversation with a quartermaster at the Guyana Defense Force and vehemently making that point. How it is that we are going to, there was a very symbolic gesture in India's quest for independence when India's weavers, who made the finest muslin in the world and exported it to the furthest reaches of the world, their fingers were broken, their looms were shattered, and coarse English cloth was sent to India in order to bolster the English economy. When Mahatma Gandhi did a very poignant march to the sea to make salt, he made salt from the sea to show Indians that they had salt. They did not need to depend on British imported salt. It was a turning point in the psyche around the quest for India's independence. And today, if you go to India, you will see cars, buses in heavy industry made at home. We need to understand that we can continue to percolate in the mental slavery that colonialization left us with, or we can begin to have pride in our own. And part of that journey, Ms. Wilburg, part of that journey is also valuing our people. The second most important patrimony, other than our arable land and fresh water, is that we have 6 races in this country. Each of those ethnicities bring an anthropological history, a culture of solutions for living, for governance, for jurisprudence, for beauty, for music, for art. And we have 6 of them here. So part of valuing our natural tapestry for the kinds of products we can produce is also valuing each other and understanding that the Amerindians in our high Pacaraimas bring these beautiful traditions and solutions for health. But you can't truly appreciate an Amerindian product if you don't understand and embrace the harmony with which the Amerindian culture has stewarded our environment for those many, many thousands of years. So it's about also respecting ourselves. What do we say when we rush off and we buy, coconut powder in a packet from Costa Rica? The Costa Ricans can make better coconut than us?
Well, that's a very important point there, Professor Narayan, and that's something that Kaieteur News has extensively written on and supported, the need for supporting local products, local industries. And you touched on a very important point there that I'd like to develop just very quickly. You have spoken about the need for ensuring skilled labor and the fact that there's a declining access where that is concerned, and even a lack of foreign direct investment. These are major issues, not just for Guyana, but the region as a whole. How do you believe Guyana and its sister countries in CARICOM and further afield can position itself through policies and structural positioning to address these issues? And how can oil and gas play a role in leading that process?
Kiana, this is a great question. Everything we've been talking about today, I think at its very lowest common denominator relates to capital. How to use oil and gas capital. Our Caribbean region receives 0.22% of all foreign direct investment in the world. It
Wow.
almost receives no foreign direct investment. Okay, that's a indicting number.
Wow.
Um,
0.22.
0.22%. So in
Wow.
absolute terms, it's 0.022 of the amount of quanta of foreign direct investment. What has that meant for our region? It means that as we emerged out of our colonial history with a dearth of infrastructure and a dearth of skilled labor, because of course we were brought to work on the plantations. We were not in any large numbers brought here to be technocrats and managers. So the newly independent nations emerged onto self-governance with a dearth of infrastructure, economies that were targeted umbilically to benefit the parent country, and a labor force that percolated without the right skills. We did not see the foreign direct investment land in the country. So our immense reserves of fossil fuels, or immense reserves of agricultural land, our rare earth metals, our gold, our diamond, our bauxite, or all of the plethora of resources we've seen in this country, has continued to remain a potential. The reason why we must not begin to consider that we should put the petroleum back into the ground is because the world demands it, we can supply it, and if we're wise, we can use that to replace that paucity of foreign direct investment. We, through our own capital, can seed our own industries. And this is why oil and gas is so transformative. Not because of the wealth that will suddenly descend, but because of the ability to use that capital to self-determine, the ability to use that capital to supplant the paucity of foreign direct investment. But labor, you mentioned. Labor is the fulcrum on which all of this balances. Because if you look at the world, it's not just a Caribbean problem. The world, the developed world, Japan, Europe and Western Europe and North America, all have a birth rate which is significantly outstripped by their demand for skilled labor. Mm-hmm. The only place in the world, and the same thing with Southeast Asia, the same thing with China, same thing with India. They're not producing enough skilled labor to fuel the growth in their economies. The only place that we have a bit of an oversupply of labor is actually sub-Saharan Africa. Mm-hmm. So therefore, in the Caribbean, and most of our people in the Caribbean, by the way, are stolen by Europe and North America because they want people with intellectual capital. So skilled labor here and absorptive capacity are intricately linked. Unless we begin to invest in our educational institutions, unless the University of Guyana, our technical institutes, our training in high schools, and the cohesiveness and defragmentation of our institutions of tertiary learning across the Caribbean begins to occur immediately, our ability to produce that skilled labor, to have that absorptive capacity, to be led by bright young minds into the future, will simply be scuttled. And all of that capital will not save us, because we will see an army of expatriate interests take over our ability to be productive. And that would be a disaster.
Professor Narayan, thank you so much for your insightful input on this very important topic, climate change and using a portion of our oil revenue to build sustainable industries. Your final thoughts, even it's sad that we have to close today's discussion, but your final thoughts, if we can, in a minute before we close today's program.
I think what I want to say is that keep the conversation going. Unless we begin to talk to each other, we will not find ways and solutions. But do not restrict the conversation to your ethnic group. Do not restrict the conversation to your economic class. Do not restrict the conversation to your social circles. So I want to encourage you to continue to focus. I know that the oil and gas industry has not received always the most pleasant of commentaries, including from yourself. But there are very pleasant things to talk about as well. The world is a hopeful one. I think the future can be extremely bright. And the only thing we must be scared of is our own lethargy, our own inaction, and our own disunity.
That's a very important point there, and I can say I can lend some support to that as well. Professor Narayan, thank you so much for being part of today's discussion. We hope to have you back for more insightful input on the entire discussion on where Guyana's future lies with this oil and gas revenue, this oil and gas resource. To our listeners, wherever you may be, thank you so much for participating in today's discussion. We hope to have you join us next week, same time, same place, for another discussion on Guyana's oil and you. Thank you so much and stay safe.